The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. It came through Mark, slipped into a text message between two unrelated conversations, casual in the way that things are casual when someone has rehearsed the casualness. Hey, Lauren's organizing a surprise thing for you Saturday. Don't tell her I told you. Just show up at Meridian at 8. He added a laughing emoji. I stared at the message for a moment, then smiled and put my phone face down on my desk the way I'd been doing lately, without noticing I'd picked up the habit. A surprise party. Lauren had never organized one before. Birthdays in our marriage had been quiet, intentional things, the two of us at a restaurant we liked, a bottle of wine, the particular intimacy of a celebration that didn't require an audience. The idea of her planning something large and coordinated felt slightly off-register, like a piece of music played in the wrong key. Not wrong enough to stop and question, just different enough to notice. My name is James. I was 36 years old, and I had been married to Lauren for 7 years, long enough for the marriage to have its own weather patterns, its own recurring seasons of closeness and distance, its own private language of small gestures and unspoken agreements. We had no children, by choice and then by circumstance, and then by a gradual, unspoken mutual deferral that had stopped being discussed entirely. We had a house with a kitchen that got good morning light and a garden Lauren had claimed as her project, and a life that looked, from the outside and often from the inside, like exactly what we had both wanted. I worked in financial planning, a job that required the particular skill of seeing patterns in data before they became obvious, of reading what the numbers suggested rather than what they stated. I was good at it professionally. It turned out the skill had a blind spot, and that blind spot was shaped exactly like my own marriage. Lauren had been different for about 4 months. Not dramatically, nothing that announced itself as a crisis. The changes were the kind that arrived gradually enough to seem like weather rather than decision. She started working later on Tuesdays and Thursdays, then occasionally on Fridays. Her phone, which had always been left wherever she set it, began migrating to her pocket or face down on surfaces. She was present at dinner, but somewhere else behind her eyes, engaged enough with the logistics of conversation that you wouldn't notice unless you were paying the specific kind of attention I had been paying and then deliberately discounting. The ring was the thing I kept not thinking about. She had stopped wearing it about 6 weeks before the invitation from Mark. Not suddenly. She'd left it off once, then twice, then regularly, until its absence became the new normal without either of us having named the transition. I had asked once, lightly, whether it was bothering her finger. She said she'd been washing her hands more at work and kept forgetting to put it back on. I said fine. I said it was fine, and I meant it, and I also knew, somewhere below the level of the words, that I was accepting an explanation because the alternative required more courage than I had available that evening. Looking back, the ring was the clearest signal of everything that followed, not because of what it symbolized in the abstract, but because of the specific moment she stopped wearing it and the specific ease with which I accepted the explanation. A person who forgets a ring puts it back on. A person who has stopped needing what it represents leaves it on the nightstand. Saturday came with the particular quality of late autumn, cold and clear, the sky a pale, washed blue that made everything look slightly more defined than usual. I dressed carefully, which I told myself was because it was a party and not because I was bracing for something. I drove to Meridian, which was a renovated event space downtown, all exposed brick and warm Edison lighting, the kind of venue that required advance booking and more effort than a casual gathering warranted. I should have asked Mark more questions. I should have asked why Lauren, who had never organized a surprise party, who preferred intimate over crowded, who had been emotionally absent for 4 months, had suddenly decided to plan something that required a venue booking and a guest list. I walked through the door at 8 o'clock. The room was full of people I recognized. Friends, colleagues, a few faces from Lauren's work. Someone near the entrance said, "There he is," and a sound went through the room that was almost like a cheer, and I smiled and looked for Lauren and found her across the room near the bar. She was standing with a man I knew, Eric Jennings, her former coworker from the firm she'd left 18 months ago. A man whose name had appeared in our conversations perhaps a dozen times over the years, never significantly, never as anything other than background detail, the way colleagues appear and disappear in the margins of a spouse's professional life. He had his hand on the small of her back. It was a small gesture, entirely deniable in isolation. The kind of thing you could explain away as friendliness, as proximity, as nothing. But it wasn't the gesture itself that stopped me where I stood. It was the way Lauren was leaning into it, the slight, unconscious shift of her weight toward him, the particular ease of a body that is entirely comfortable with being touched by someone. She hadn't leaned into me like that in 4 months. The smile on my face went on existing out of momentum, while something beneath it went very, very still. 7 years of marriage builds a particular kind of architecture. Not just the shared furniture and the joint accounts and the routines that slot together like interlocking pieces, but an internal map of another person. You learn their rhythms, the way they move through a morning, the specific sound of their footsteps on the stairs when something is wrong. You learn what their silences mean and which ones to leave alone and which ones to walk toward. I had built that map over 7 years. What I hadn't done was update it when the territory changed. Lauren was a project manager at a design consultancy, a job that suited her in the way that certain jobs suit certain people, that matched her natural combination of organizational precision and aesthetic instinct. She was good at it, and she knew she was good at it, which gave her a professional confidence I had always found attractive. She left the firm she'd been at for 4 years about 18 months ago, moving to a smaller studio with less corporate structure and, she said, more creative autonomy. The transition had been smooth. She seemed happier for about 2 months. Then something shifted. I couldn't locate the exact moment. Looking back, it was too gradual for a moment. It was more like the way a room temperature drops when a window has been left open somewhere. You register it eventually, but not in time to do anything efficient about the cold. The Tuesday and Thursday late evenings started in July. She always had a reason, a client presentation, a deadline, a collaborative meeting that had run over. The reasons were individually plausible. Cumulatively, they formed a pattern I noticed without naming. The way you notice a sound you can't identify and decide it's probably mechanical, probably unrelated to you. I made dinner on those evenings. I left a plate covered on the stove. She came home somewhere between 9 and 10, ate the reheated food, and told me about her day in the abbreviated way of someone who is managing how much they reveal rather than simply summarizing. I listened and asked questions and told myself that the editorial quality of her summaries was just tiredness, just the compression of a long day into a short evening. I didn't ask the question I should have asked. Not because I was incurious. I was deeply, uncomfortably curious. But because I had developed, somewhere in the middle of the marriage, the habit of treating Lauren's comfort as more important than my own clarity. I told myself that was consideration. I understand now that it was avoidance dressed as kindness. The phone changed in August. Not dramatically. She didn't suddenly become secretive in a way that would have been impossible to ignore. It was subtler. The phone moved from surfaces to pockets. The screen tilted away in certain moments. She started taking calls in the other room when she had always taken them wherever she happened to be standing. Each adjustment was small enough to seem like preference rather than concealment. I mentioned it once. I said something light. "You're very mysterious lately," in the tone people use to approach something they're not ready to approach directly. She laughed and said she'd been trying to be less glued to it, more present. It was a good answer. It was the kind of answer that makes you feel slightly ridiculous for having asked. Mark had been my closest friend since university, the kind of friendship that had survived distance and different life phases and the gradual divergence of two people who had started from the same point. He was perceptive in the blunt, unsentimental way of someone who has no investment in telling you what you want to hear. I had coffee with him in September and mentioned, without framing it as concern, that Lauren seemed preoccupied lately. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Has she mentioned Eric at all?" I looked at him. "Jennings? What?" He shrugged, the specific shrug of someone who has already decided how much they're going to say. I ran into them at Callaway's last week. Tuesday evening. They seemed close. I said that Lauren had worked with Eric for years, that it made sense they'd stayed in touch. Mark nodded in the way that means, "I've told you what I can tell you without telling you what I actually think." I drove home and didn't mention it to Lauren. I put it in the same place I'd put everything else, the file I was building and refusing to open. The ring came off in late September. I noticed on a Thursday morning, the kind of noticing that registers in the peripheral vision and then takes a moment to surface into conscious thought. She was making coffee, both hands around the mug, and the left one was bare in a way it hadn't been the day before. I asked about it that evening. She gave me the explanation about hand washing, about forgetting. Her voice was even. Her eyes were somewhere slightly to the left of mine. Even now, I can feel the specific quality of that conversation, the way we were both present in the room and both somewhere else entirely. I accepted what she said because the alternative was a conversation I couldn't see the far side of. That was the first point of no return, though I didn't know it then. The ring wasn't lost. It had been set aside, and I let that happen without asking what it meant. October arrived, and the distance became something I could no longer attribute entirely to stress or season or the ordinary fluctuations of a long relationship. Lauren and I had always been physically easy with each other, not dramatically affectionate in public, but naturally comfortable in private. The casual intimacy of two people who had shared a bed and a bathroom and a kitchen for 7 years. That ease had been withdrawing for months. But in October, it became something I could no longer explain away. She moved through the house with a slight physical guardedness. Not hostility, nothing aggressive, simply a new awareness of proximity that hadn't been there before. If I entered a room she was in, something in her posture adjusted almost imperceptibly. The small reflexive touch, hand on the shoulder, brief contact in the kitchen, had stopped happening entirely. I noticed all of it. I documented none of it. I kept rebuilding the file and not opening it. The name Eric surfaced again in early October, more concretely this time. Lauren mentioned, over dinner, that she'd had lunch with an old colleague. She didn't name the colleague. I asked who, keeping the question light, performatively casual. She paused before answering. Not long, half a second, the duration of someone making a small decision. Eric, she said. We worked together for years. It's not a big deal. I know, I said. I didn't say it was. The conversation moved on, but the half-second pause had lodged somewhere specific and refused to dislodge. I looked Eric Jennings up that evening, something I had thought about and avoided doing since Mark's coffee shop comment in September. His professional profile was straightforward. Design director at a firm across town. Well-credentialed, well-connected. His social media was minimal and told me nothing useful. What it told me, by its very blankness, was that he was a private person, which meant what existed between him and Lauren would not be visible in the places I was looking. Claire, a mutual friend who moved in Lauren's social circle more than mine, called me that week. She called ostensibly to discuss a dinner we'd been loosely planning for weeks. But there was something slightly effortful in her cheerfulness that I noticed and couldn't account for. She asked how things were going, with the particular emphasis people put on the question when they already know the answer might be complicated. I told her things were fine. She said good in a way that wasn't entirely convincing. After the call, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, thinking about the architecture of what I knew. Ring off since September. Tuesday and Thursday evenings consistently absent. Mark's unremarked observation at Callaway's. The half-second pause before a name. Claire's careful cheerfulness. None of these was a fact. All of them were data points that a part of my brain had been quietly assembling into a shape I kept refusing to look at directly. The Saturday of the invitation arrived 3 days after Claire's call. I spent that Saturday morning in the particular state of a man who is trying to feel normal and almost succeeding. I read the paper. I made coffee twice. I went for a run that was longer than usual because running had always been good for converting anxiety into something more manageable. When I came back, Lauren was in the garden she'd claimed as her project 2 years ago and had barely touched in months. She was standing at the edge of it with her arms crossed, looking at something I couldn't see, and she didn't hear me come through the back gate. I watched her for a moment. She looked, from behind, like someone waiting for something. Not impatient, just waiting. That image is still with me with a clarity that other memories from that period don't have. Her standing at the edge of her own garden, not tending it, not planning it, just standing at the border of it, as if she were deciding whether to step further in or turn around entirely. I understand now what she was standing at the border of. It wasn't the garden. I went inside without speaking. I showered and dressed and drove to Meridian at 8 o'clock and walked through the door into a room full of people and found my wife leaning into another man's touch with the ease of someone who had been doing it for a long time. I stayed at the party for 40 minutes after I arrived. 40 minutes of functioning on the surface. Accepting congratulations from people who had no idea what was happening inside me, taking the drink someone pressed into my hand, making the sounds that the situation required. I was operating on a kind of split screen. The external performance of a man at his own surprise party, and the internal machinery of a man rapidly and precisely assembling everything he had been refusing to assemble for months. Eric Jennings moved away from Lauren when I crossed the room toward them. Not guiltily, too smoothly for guilt, with the calibrated ease of someone who had anticipated this moment and prepared for it. He offered his hand and said it was good to see me and smiled in the straightforward way of a man who has decided that confidence is his best available strategy. Lauren kissed me on the cheek. Her lips were cool. She said happy birthday, and the words were correct and entirely hollow. I shook Eric's hand. I smiled. I said something about being surprised, which was true in more ways than anyone in the room understood. For the next 40 minutes, I moved through the party and gathered information the way I gathered financial data. Not dramatically, not accusatorially, just systematically, letting people tell me things they didn't know they were telling me. A colleague of Lauren's mentioned, without apparent awareness of its significance, that she and Eric had been seen together several times recently. Always framed as old friends catching up, always plausible, always with the slightly too clean quality of a story that has been told enough times to have its edges smoothed. Mark found me near the bar midway through the evening. He had a drink in his hand and the expression of a man who is profoundly uncomfortable with what he knows. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Tell me what you know," I said quietly. He looked at his drink. "James." "Mark." A pause. He looked up. "I should have told you sooner." "I know that. I saw them together 3 times over the past 2 months. Not just lunch." "I didn't. I kept thinking it would resolve itself, or that I was reading it wrong. 3 times. Over 2 months. While I had been making covered plates and leaving them on the stove and accepting half-second pauses as explanations. That was the moment the file opened. Not a crack, fully. Everything I had been filing away over 4 months assembled itself in approximately 30 seconds into a picture I could no longer deny the shape of. And the strangest part was that I didn't feel rage. I felt a terrible, clarifying calm. The kind that comes when you've been uncertain for so long that certainty, even devastating certainty, registers first as relief. Claire found me next, near the edge of the room. She was the one who confirmed what I already knew, not through any dramatic disclosure, but through the specific way she apologized. "I should have said something," she said. "I convinced myself it wasn't my place. I'm sorry, James." You don't apologize for not intervening in something innocent. The apology was its own confession. I found Eric near the entrance as the party began to thin. Lauren was across the room, talking to someone, positioned in a way that suggested she was watching me without appearing to. I walked up to Eric and looked at him directly and said, very quietly, "How long?" He had the decency not to pretend he didn't understand the question. He looked at me for a moment, measuring, I think, whether honesty or deflection served him better, and then said, "About 5 months." 5 months. I nodded. I thanked him. It was the most absurd thing I had ever said, and I meant it completely, because what he had given me, in that single honest answer, was the end of uncertainty. The 4 months of signals and silences and half-second pauses and covered plates left on the stove all collapsed into a single coherent fact, and the fact, however devastating, was cleaner than the ambiguity had been. I walked back across the room and stood in front of Lauren. The room had thinned enough by then that what happened next was witnessed by perhaps 15 people, which was 15 more than I would have chosen. But I had stopped managing the optics approximately 40 minutes earlier, and the version of me that had walked into Meridian at 8 o'clock, the one who smiled through things and let explanations land without examination, had quietly ceased to operate. Lauren saw my face and knew. Not that I had spoken to Eric. She may not have seen that. But she saw something in my expression that told her the performance was over, and she went very still in the way of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment and has now arrived at it. "Can we go outside?" I said. She came. We stood on the pavement in the cold, the noise of the party muffled behind us, the street quiet in the way of late Saturday evenings. She had her arms wrapped around herself, though it wasn't cold enough to justify the posture entirely. She was wearing the dark green dress she kept for occasions she cared about. Her left hand was bare. "Eric told me 5 months," I said. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the defensiveness I'd half expected wasn't there. What was there was something rawer, exhaustion and guilt, and the particular heaviness of someone who has been carrying a secret long enough that its weight has become the new normal. "James." I'm not asking you to explain it, I said. I'm asking you to tell me what's true. A pause. The street. A car passing 2 blocks away. It started as, we just talked. After I left the firm, I missed having people who understood the work. He reached out, and I didn't mean for it to become what it became. She stopped. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. What did it become? She was quiet for long enough that the silence was its own answer. Did you want to leave me? I asked. The question surprised her. I could see it. She had been braced for anger, for accusation, and I had given her something she hadn't prepared for. No, she said. I don't. I don't know how to explain it. I wasn't trying to replace you. I wasn't planning anything. She stopped again. You just found something with him that you weren't finding with me, I said. She looked at me with an expression that might have been relief at being understood and grief at the cost of that understanding arriving this way. I'm sorry, she said. I know how insufficient that is. I know I handled everything wrong. The ring, the way I've been the last few months, the lying about where I was. I handled all of it wrong, and I know that. She was telling the truth in that moment, all of it. And I believed her, and the believing made it worse rather than better, because the problem wasn't the dishonesty anymore. The problem was what the dishonesty had been protecting. She had found something real, or real enough to sustain 5 months, and I had been standing on the other side of a wall I hadn't known was there. Did you think about telling me? I asked. Every day, she said. I kept thinking I'd end it. And then it would be over, and I wouldn't have to tell you, and we could just, she stopped, go back to normal. Yes. I stood with that for a moment. The cold air. The bare left hand. The dark green dress she'd worn to a party that had been, I understood now, something other than what I'd been told it was. Not a surprise for me, but something she had needed to do. Some collision she had been steering toward and away from simultaneously. Some resolution that she couldn't manufacture on her own. I can't do this, I said. Not loudly. Evenly. James, please, we can go to counseling. We can. Lauren. She stopped. I believe that you're sorry. I believe you didn't plan it, and I believe you didn't want to lose what we had. But you spent 5 months choosing this every day. And I spent 4 months watching something be wrong and accepting every explanation and not asking the real questions because I didn't want the real answers. I paused. We were both somewhere else. We just went to different places. She had tears on her face. I didn't look away. I need to go, I said. I walked back to my car. She called my name once from the pavement. The sound of it, her voice, the word, the particular quality of a person reaching for something they know is already out of reach, is the detail I've carried longest from that night. I drove home to an empty house and sat in the kitchen with the good morning light turned to the blue-gray of a late November night. And I understood something about myself that I hadn't understood before. I had confused stability with intimacy, presence with connection, the absence of crisis with the presence of love. And I had been doing it for long enough that I'd stopped noticing the difference. The weeks after Meridian were the quietest I had known in years. Lauren came home that night. It was still her house, technically, still her kitchen and her garden and the bed she'd shared with me for 7 years. We coexisted in a careful, muted way for 2 weeks while the practicalities were figured out and the conversations that needed to happen were had. They were not dramatic conversations. They were, in some ways, the most honest we had managed in months, stripped of the performance that ordinary life had required and reduced to the essential questions of what would happen next. She asked, twice, whether there was any possibility I would reconsider. I told her honestly both times that I didn't think so. Not because I didn't understand what she'd been going through. I did, by then, better than I wanted to. Not because I stopped caring about her, which would have been cleaner and wasn't true, but because I had spent the weeks since the party doing the accounting that I should have been doing for the past year. And the accounting told me something I couldn't argue with. We had stopped finding our way to each other long before Eric Jennings appeared, and the affair was the symptom of that failure, not its cause. Staying without addressing the underlying distance would have meant repeating the same slow erosion, and I was done with slow erosions. She moved out on a Saturday, the last Saturday in November, cold and overcast in the way that month ends. She took what was obviously hers and left what was clearly shared for us to sort later, and she carried the last box to her car and stood in the driveway for a moment before getting in. She didn't look back at the house. I watched from the window and understood that she was grieving too, differently but genuinely. And that understanding didn't change anything, but it made the whole thing slightly less bleak. Mark and I had coffee the week after. He apologized properly, not defensively, not with excuses, just a direct acknowledgement that he had known more than he'd said and had handled it badly. I told him I didn't blame him for finding it difficult, which was true, and that it would take a while for the friendship to be what it had been, which was also true. He nodded. We talked about other things. We're still finding our way back to each other, slowly, the way long friendships sometimes require after a rupture. Claire called once and said very little, which was the right amount. I worked through the winter with the slightly mechanical productivity of a person who has lost the ability to be distracted by anything other than the work in front of them. There was a project in January that required more concentration than I'd given anything in months, and I was grateful for it. Grateful for the requirement to be precise and present and focused on a problem that had a solution, a clean answer that revealed itself if you looked at the data long enough. The house felt different without Lauren in it. Not worse. Exactly. Different in the way a room feels different when the furniture has been rearranged, familiar but altered, requiring a new map. I rearranged some things. I didn't touch the garden, which was hers in a way that went beyond legal ownership, and in the spring I found someone to help me understand what it needed. It turned out to be simpler than I'd thought. There were mornings in those months when I would make coffee and stand at the kitchen window in the good morning light and think about the party. Not with anger, which had burned itself out relatively quickly, but with the particular retrospective clarity of someone who has been through something and is trying to understand it honestly. What I kept arriving at was this. The warning signs had been there for months, visible to anyone paying real attention, and I had chosen to pay a different kind of attention, the kind that registers information and then files it under reasons it might mean something other than what it clearly means. That was the thing I had to sit with most honestly, not the betrayal, but my own participation in the conditions that made it possible. Not as self-blame, because the choices Lauren made were hers, and I'm not responsible for them, but as information about the pattern I'd developed of treating discomfort as something to manage rather than a signal worth following. Sometime in the spring, I had dinner with someone. Briefly, carefully, in the way you do things when you're not ready, but you're also not entirely not ready. Nothing came of it in the immediate sense. But I noticed, spending 2 hours in genuine conversation with another person, how differently I was listening, how present I was, how much I had apparently been saving the good attention for professional contexts and running on something considerably less for the personal ones. That observation was worth more than the dinner. 7 years is not a small thing to lose. I don't treat it as a small thing. There was real love in it, at the beginning certainly, and in substantial portions through the middle, and possibly at the end too, running alongside everything else in the complicated way that feelings refuse to be tidy when a story isn't. What I've come to believe is that love isn't sufficient on its own, that it requires, alongside it, the willingness to keep looking, keep asking, keep updating the map when the territory changes. We had both stopped doing that, for different reasons and in different directions, and the distance that opened up between us was where everything else eventually moved in. I fixed the kitchen window latch that had been sticking since autumn. I started running in the mornings again, properly, with the intention of something rather than just the conversion of anxiety. I called my sister, who lives 3 hours away and who had been gently, consistently present through the winter without ever making it about herself, which is a quality I have come to value enormously. The life that existed on the other side of that night at Meridian was smaller in some ways and quieter in others. But it was, for the first time in a long time, built on ground I had actually examined. What this story reveals, looked at with the full picture in view, is not simply the anatomy of an affair. It's the portrait of two people who had stopped investing in each other with real attention, and what fills the space when genuine attention withdraws. Lauren's relationship with Eric did not begin because she was a dishonest person or because the marriage had been bad. It began because something had gone unaddressed in the marriage for long enough that when an alternative presented itself, someone who listened with undivided attention, who found her professionally compelling, who asked questions she hadn't been asked at home, the emotional pull of it was stronger than her commitment to addressing the deficit directly. That is not a justification. The choices she made were sustained and deliberate, and the deception that protected them, the phone management, the half-truths, the ring removed and left on the nightstand, accumulated into a pattern of active dishonesty that crossed a line from struggle into betrayal. What it is, however, is an explanation, and the story earns its complexity by refusing to flatten her into simple villainy. What the story does something more interesting with is James. His blind spot was not naivety. He was intelligent, observant, professionally skilled at reading patterns. His blind spot was the habitual prioritization of surface stability over honest inquiry. Every time a signal appeared, he made a calculation. Asking this question will cost more than not asking it, at least right now. He filed the ring. He filed Mark's comment at Calloway's. He filed the half-second pause before Eric's name. He filed Claire's careful cheerfulness. The filing system was so efficient that by the time the party arrived, it contained months of unexamined evidence, and the act of finally opening it, triggered by Eric's hand on Lauren's back, took approximately 30 seconds. That efficiency is the story's most uncomfortable truth. We are often not deceived by the people who betray us as much as we are by the internal economies we develop to avoid the cost of seeing clearly. James did not lack access to the truth. He lacked, for months, the willingness to pay what clarity would have required. The party forced payment, but the bill had been accumulating long before that Saturday. The moment of no return, examined honestly, was not the confrontation outside Meridian or even Eric's 5-month admission at the entrance. It was the party itself, the moment Lauren conceived it or agreed to it, knowing Eric would be there, knowing James would arrive, constructing a situation that was either a final test of whether James would see what was happening or an unconscious engineering of the collision she couldn't manufacture through conversation. Either reading is psychologically consistent with what she did and said afterward. She hadn't planned to leave, hadn't planned to be caught, hadn't planned anything cleanly. She had been suspended for months between two versions of her life and had finally, perhaps involuntarily, forced the choice. James's walking away, not in rage, but with the specific calm of a man who has just done the accounting and read the result, is the story's moral resolution. He does not punish her. He does not perform injury. He simply concludes. And in that conclusion is the lesson the whole story has been building toward. That dignity, in the aftermath of betrayal, looks less like justice and more like clarity. The willingness to see what was real, to own your part in the conditions without excusing the choices of others, and to build what comes next on ground you've actually measured. The detail that stays with me longest from this story is the ring. Not the affair, not the party, not even the confrontation on the pavement. The ring that came off in September and stayed off, and the explanation James accepted because the alternative required more than he had available that evening. There's something in that small moment that feels true beyond this particular story. We all have things we see and choose not to examine, not out of stupidity, but out of the very human preference for a world that is still intact over a world that requires rebuilding. The ring was sitting on the nightstand for weeks before everything else surfaced. Sometimes the smallest thing is the truest signal, and the hardest part isn't missing it. It's admitting you saw it and looked away.